Spotify wasn't supposed to succeed, but the way that its founder was able to find the first big investor was just one of the stories that makes you believe that there had to be an element of fate that they were able to make it this far with everything working against them. From his teens, Daniel Ek was very brilliant and eager to develop something. So at the age of 14, he started building custom websites as a freelance programmer. At first, he charged $100 for each, then raised it to $200. Then, when it was clear that it was a very successful idea, he assembled a group of high school friends to work alongside him. Bit by bit, they started to charge $5,000 for a website, and in total made around $50,000 a month. But Daniel wasn't driven only by technology and programming. He had another passion: music. When he was 5 years old, his grandparents presented him with a guitar, and since that time, Daniel had been passionate about music. Whilst a teen, Daniel was listening to music with the help of Napster, a music sharing service that allowed users to share songs and download as many as they wanted. But Napster was deep in piracy, which was the main issue why it was taken down. Daniel observed that situation and made a decision to create an alternative to Napster, which would be much better than piracy. When Daniel was 23, he worked in several IT companies and founded his first startup, Advertigo, which was an online advertising company. It was a huge success. In 2006, Trade Doubler, which was a digital marketing company, purchased it. We made money when we were incredibly young, and in the beginning, we didn't handle it that well. When you're a computer geek, you think you want to be the guy with all the girls at the table, but I realized after a while, that ain't me. Daniel met with Martin Lorentzen, who was the head of Trade Doubler at the time, and in 2006, after spending numerous days tweaking the idea of the alternative to Napster, Daniel Ek and Martin Lorentzen created Spotify. We pretty much spent all the autumn just discussing a ton of ideas. I remember, however, that we sat around my media HTPC machine quite a lot and thought that it was cumbersome to get content, despite the technology having been around since at least 2000. I think that's why we got stuck on the idea of Spotify. They opened their first office in Stockholm, with some of the employees being college classmates and former colleagues of Daniel. Before running a prototype so that they could find investors and pitch them an idea, Daniel and Lorentzen needed the data, but there was no way to legally acquire that much music in a very short time. So despite being better than piracy, they had to pirate it. Specifically, they downloaded tons of tracks that were worth billions of dollars and got numerous catalogs of famous artists. That act let them have the valuable data and sought investment after, which at that time was Creandum. It was 2003 when the company that supports and invests in a number of promising and now successful startups was born. From the beginning, Creandum operated in Stockholm, Sweden, but in a few years they opened firms in London, Berlin, and San Francisco. Usually they invest in the project along with 4 to 5 partakers who are usually very, very big fish. They usually don't invest in the startup right away. They spend some time observing it, and then after evaluating some risks and trends, they make their investment. The whole process could take anywhere from 2 to 3 years. And they've invested in startups from a wide range of fields, from mobile, software, financial technology, and information technology. So it was 2006, and Frederick Cassell was at KTH School of Technology on business. He was sourcing new deals. While he was watching a video about what happened that day, he noticed Andreas Ahn, who was the CTO of Spotify, making a pitch about Spotify. It wasn't very clear from the presentation what Spotify completely was, but it looked captivating. And it was clear that the audience was interested in what Andreas was talking about, despite not many details being present. Frederick was intrigued by the presentation, so he made a call and got the answer that Frederick had to talk to another guy, Daniel Ek. When Frederick and Daniel began talking, the first thing that Daniel was interested in was what was going on at Creandum, and he liked the answer he got. From that call, the relationship between Spotify and Creandum started. Creandum was following Spotify for a good 18 months, which were full of negotiations before eventually making an investment and putting everything on paper. At first, it seemed impossible what Spotify was offering to the public. It was 2007, a peak of piracy, an immense success of sites such as BitTorrent, uTorrent, LimeWire, and every magazine or newspaper was predicting the fall of the recorded music industry. I realized that you can never legislate away from piracy. Laws can definitely help, but it doesn't take away the problem. The only way to solve the problem was to create a service that was better than piracy, and at the same time compensate the music industry. That gave us Spotify. So in order to be successful, and be opposed to such a tendency, Spotify had to be better than piracy, which meant that you had to have immediate access to every song in the world, and it had to be free of charge. Creandum believed that if it was possible, then a new audience would emerge. Frederick was the 704th user when he tried it out, and it worked. So when he tried it out, he was overwhelmed, almost in awe. And it was during his first meeting with Martin and Daniel when they asked Frederick to think of any song he would like to listen to. And he chose a small local artist, the Bear Quartet, and miraculously, their songs were on Spotify, and they played. We spent an insane amount of time focusing on latency when no one cared because we were hell-bent on making it feel like you had all the world's music on your hard drive. Obsessing over small details can sometimes make all the difference. That's what I believe is the biggest misunderstanding about the minimum viable product concept. That is the V in the MVP. Having songs loaded so quickly wasn't the only thing that pushed Frederick to invest in Spotify. It was also the founders who complemented each other and at the same time had separate might and the frankness to say no to deals that they didn't like. And during 18 months of negotiations, there were many moments when they gave a hard no to the deal that was on the table, which resulted in Martin and Daniel making a lot of hard but fair choices for the company in the future since they didn't take any shortcuts. They got straight to what they wanted. And it looked like the way Daniel and Martin were doing business with Creandum was common for them. Either way, Frederick got the feeling that it was the way to make a lot of money, and soon after, they would close the deal. The next thing that wasn't any less shocking was when Spotify launched its first demo on mobile phones. At that time, it was still perceived as something far from reality, especially when Nokia was running the game. Spotify was seen at the time more as a desktop music library replacement rather than something that could run on mobile. Nevertheless, when Daniel Ek told Frederick that the mobile version would have the same functionality as the desktop one, it was almost unbelievable, but definitely not impossible. The first Spotify mobile app was launched on Nokia Series 60, and Gustav, who was head of mobile at the time, streamed various songs. Everyone in the room where that miracle happened was shocked, to say the least. And over time, Spotify found its way to the iPhone after the App Store emerged. Frederick remembered that day when he was walking to the office from home, and he was listening to Spotify while using 3G on his phone, and he thought he had entered a whole new world. From its early days, Spotify was in a niche that was right in the middle between two extremes, piracy and iTunes, who were selling tracks separately for anywhere from $1 to $2, and as soon as Spotify launched its beta, it needed users to test it and attract even more people. And for that purpose, they contacted influential bloggers in Sweden and asked them to try it. This move turned out to be extremely effective, and those bloggers were in awe of the product and were eager to advertise it by spreading the word around. But that wasn't enough to make Spotify profitable. It wouldn't become for many years later. Daniel had to get on board the three big players of the music industry, Sony, Warner, and Universal. And it wasn't easy because those titans of music weren't interested in anything free, and the idea that money was coming only from ads seemed like a failure to them when they were already getting crushed by piracy. So to strike that deal, Daniel Ek had to wave off some of his principles, especially those of free music, and launch a paid version for a fixed monthly fee. But even that wasn't enough for the major labels. After months of exhausting negotiations, a common ground was reached. A paid version with a monthly fee, a 70% cut of revenue, and shares of 1/5 from Spotify stock. Finally, Spotify was launched in 2008. In the next couple of months, Spotify started Big Clean, a process of scrubbing all the content they had acquired illegally. There was no need for it because now they had catalogs from the labels that they wanted. Time passed, and major players in the music industry didn't forget to continuously throw obstacles from time to time. The Big Three was becoming more power hungry, and they disliked Spotify having a free version. They started to threaten Spotify to withhold licenses if Spotify wouldn't do as they pleased. Spotify had to oblige and take away features from the free version, encouraging people to pay for music. It was very disappointing for the engineers that worked at Spotify and top management as well. Then it became worse again when they found out that Spotify was seeking more funding from investors, and they wanted a bigger cut, but that didn't happen. At the end of the summer of 2009, Spotify was still not on the US market, but there were some backdoors to downloading it from Europe. The CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, used those backdoors and posted on his page, "Spotify is so good. after receiving a hint from Sean Parker, who was a major player in Napster. Napster was my first attempt at building a company and one of my early attempts at building a usable product. While I'm proud of the impact we had, I'm not particularly proud of the interface we built, nor of the design aesthetics of the product. You have surpassed the product experience we built at Napster in all of those ways. At the end of autumn 2009, Poker Face by Lady Gaga was streamed over 1 million times on Spotify, but she was frustrated when she received a royalty check of $167. It started a wave of dissatisfaction from artists, to which Spotify answered that it wasn't the one to blame. It was the deals with record companies that artists signed to blame, though it was only the beginning of the wave of how much Spotify valued the artists and their catalogs. The music industry is currently worth $17 billion. It's going to be $40 billion or $50 billion soon. There will only be 4 or 5 players left in a few years. If that's the case, we'll end up with a company worth tens of billions. In March 2010, Daniel Ek was present at South by Southwest, where he said his expectations of releasing Spotify in the US by the end of the year, which was rather disappointing for the audience as their expectations didn't match with what they heard. Later the same spring, Spotify released a desktop music manager that made them rivals to iTunes. And at the end of fall, Spotify integrated with Shazam, which meant that every time someone launched Shazam to figure out what a track was, it would populate that song on Spotify. Right at the beginning of 2011, Adele refused to release 21 on Spotify because it wasn't her intention to limit the album only to those who were able to pay. Nevertheless, in March 2011, Daniel Ek announced that Spotify had 1 million subscribers. Bringing Spotify to the US wasn't an easy task, but manageable with the right approach. They partnered with some of the biggest brands such as Chevrolet, Coca-Cola, Motorola, Reebok, Sprite, and several more. The same strategy Spotify used in Europe with small blogs proved to be successful with massive corporations in America. Spotify showed the ads with the product of American launch partners on their free version. In response to that, they mentioned brands distributed exclusive invitations to their audiences. This generated buzz and prepped the groundwork for a successful launch in the States. And in June of 2011, Spotify launched in the USA, a year after Daniel shared his forecast about the launch at the end of 2010. The reason it took so long to launch was a lot of complications that accompanied the negotiation process with the big 3 record labels. Specifically, the business model and conversion rates of Spotify were the problems that they weren't happy about. It wasn't that the big 3 were against Spotify. On the contrary, they were eager to get behind a platform that would keep iTunes at bay. But for that, they were pushing Spotify to get in the USA with only a paid subscription model, which we would see Apple Music later adopt 4 years later. The conversion rate of Spotify in 2010 was about 7%, which was seen as far too low. They wanted it somewhere between 15 and 20% when it came to free users versus users that were on the paid subscription model. In the following decade, though, streaming revenue would eventually make it to 65% of the music industry's entire revenue sources, with Spotify the leader of the market globally for streaming platforms, having the most paid subscribers and users. Creandum had exited and sold their position in Spotify years prior to 2023. But there's no doubt that they had a profound impact in growing the company that would dominate and change the music industry forever. Our mission is to unlock the potential of human creativity by giving 1 million creative artists the opportunity to live off their art and billions of fans the opportunity to enjoy and be inspired by it. While there's a lot of controversy surrounding pay with Spotify, a lot of this is out of their control. Like we said, they were strong-armed into a position where they were giving 70% of revenue to record labels. And a lot of the reason why these artists aren't able to generate that much from Spotify is due to the fact that they're signed to deals. But the truth is, they've enabled thousands, tens of thousands even, of independent artists to earn a full-time income making music. So they definitely fulfilled their promise.